Good morning, everybody.
Hello.
This is the last day of August 2020,
Bum, bum, bum.
episode 85. And we're talking about fun stuff today, conflict and tension and polarization. So this will be a fun one.
Well, and you know what this day means? It means there's still 4 more months of 2020. So.
It seems like, just before we start formally, I can't imagine that like in 50 years, people don't talk about 2020 the way we talk about 1968 now. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
Unless this is like kind of the pre-year before the really shit.
Right, I was gonna say, right, unless things get a lot worse.
Which it could, because this is the nature of what we're talking about today. But I guess we should start with our introductions. I'm Mark Van Steenwyck. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert, direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And we are coming to you from beautiful downtown Minneapolis.
Downtown.
We've never actually said downtown-ish. Downtown adjacent.
Yeah, like, because I live a mile south of the stadium, which is downtown east.
Yeah.
And you live 2 miles south.
Yeah. So no, I mean, we're in South Minneapolis. We're downtown adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, if you're living far away and you've heard that Minneapolis is being burnt to the ground, let me assure you that it is not.
I hear this all the time, like from family, like, oh, I hear everything's bad there. It's gone to hell. And I'm like, this is how it always is. I mean, even when you see images like in the news of like war-torn areas, oftentimes it's localized, sometimes not. Or the first time I went to New York City, I thought I'd be like accosted by homeless people, because that's all you see in films. And it's like, everyone's so nice here. What the hell?
I know. Yeah.
All right. Somebody be like, I am walking here. Like, so perception. This is another piece of this thing about polarization is most people are kind of in the vague middle and don't care.
Right. Well, and most places, life is totally normal, right? And I mean, I've talked about this a lot in terms of living 2 blocks away from where George Floyd was killed. I mean, for us, within that 2-block radius, you know, life has been really intense since May 25th. But I mention to people all the time, if we lived another 3 blocks south, like, you wouldn't have really even noticed anything, you know. And I did see one person did this with a map of Portland. You know, they had the map of Portland from up above, and they had penciled in red, you know, this is where the riots are, right? It's this like teeny little box, you know, 1 block around the federal courthouse there. And of course, for most people in Portland, you know, they don't even know what's happening. And so I do think that that's an important thing to understand about this, is just as a general principle that the powers that be get a lot of bang for their buck out of exaggerating what is going on, right? And making it sound like an entire city is burning down, which is not true. You know, in Chechnya, they did bomb and burn an entire city, but we're not at that point yet. So
yeah, and this isn't to downplay, like, it's significant, you know, if you live in South Minneapolis or downtown, it's significant to see a number of places that you frequented burnt down or busted open, and that happened downtown. It's happening in other cities. So if you're right there, it is a bit traumatic.
Yeah.
And it can be unsafe. But the other thing that I often find like from people living outstate or who aren't really in the mix of things, is they assume that if they were here, they should be afraid for their lives.
Yeah, they'd be dead.
And now I'm a white man, so I have less fear of physical harm than other people would probably have. So with that caveat, I don't feel afraid. Like, I mean, I was, you know, we've been there in the middle of all this stuff.
Right.
And I was there when people were trying to burn stuff.
Yeah.
And I was very close to it. I won't say more than that.
Right.
But it wasn't, I was never afraid
Yeah.
of anyone besides the cops. And even then I wasn't that afraid because I get into a weird, like, mental state when I'm around cops where I kind of like, I get super chill. I don't know.
Yeah.
But,
well, and you know, you mentioned the thing about being a white man, but what is interesting is that the people who are most afraid, right? And we're, you know, I think I probably read 4 articles in the Star Tribune about this over the last 5 days, is that it's the white people who are afraid to come here, right? And this is the big worry, you know, that white people won't come to downtown Minneapolis now, because they're afraid for their lives. And it is kind of hilarious. I mean, especially, right, I mean, us having lived here over the last 3 months, it's just, yeah, it's a very kind of bizarre, sad state of affairs. And the thing that's important to realize is that it is all designed to scare the majority population. I mean, this whole thing that Dump is doing around, you know, we're going to make the suburbs safe again. I mean, it is all designed around this racist dog whistle kind of thing of, yeah, let's scare the upper middle class white folks so that they vote for me. I mean, there's very intentional design around that.
there's, you know, one of the things we were talking about earlier about how these sorts of moments of polarization can kind of flatten the narrative and take away complexity. And I also want to make clear, like, when I don't think polarization is entirely bad. So I think there's something about these moments that create amazing opportunities, especially if you're a leftist. Like, before Hitler rose to power, it could have gone the other way. Like, the choice wasn't like to stay in the middle. It was forcing them to either become communists or fascists. And a lot of people don't like that because they're in the middle. But if you're a leftist, it's like, oh, that could have. How fascinating would that have been? Anyways, that's an aside. But as this stuff is happening, increasingly it becomes about, one of the narratives that gets flattened is that Trump is a fascist, and therefore it's an entirely new and evil thing compared to anything we've had before. Like, that's one of the flattened narratives, that somehow Trump isn't a continuation, that he's somehow in an entirely different universe of evil than the neoliberal imperialism we had before, which I think is ridiculous. I'm not going to say I'm not going to say, oh, Hillary Clinton would have been just as bad. Like, I think that's dumb. But I'm not going to say either that they're different species altogether. Neoliberalism will always go to fascism when you have a crisis.
Well, and I mean, let's go back farther and farther before that, right? I mean, to somehow say that what's happening right now in America is worse than, you know, killing and importing 10 million Africans or killing 10 million Native Americans, you know, I mean, there's a real problem, especially on the liberal side, with making that kind of statement, because part of what it's doing is it wants to avoid, if you're white, the white liberal complicity and all of that. I mean, yeah, this is not a unique bad time in America at all. And it's not a unique bad time in the world at all. I mean, the march of authoritarianism and the rise of authoritarianism of all kinds that ends up doing a lot of harm and creating a lot of suffering has been a regular part of the human experience for millennia. And it's important for us to realize that, I think.
And another piece that gets flattened in this is you get people, I'm seeing this more and more, the same people who when the uprising happened in Minneapolis, were quick to say riots are the language of the unheard, quoting that a month later, after they get kind of tired, they're now just throwing protesters under the bus as basically responsible for the fascist backlash. So right. Then this idea becomes, and this is how it happens, is polarization we instinctively think of as a bad thing because we're herd animals, right? So we want to cling together. And so anytime there's a defined center, we kind of instinctively want to huddle to it. And so in our society, the center is neoliberalism of some form. And so whenever you have someone going further left and then they get slapped down by authoritarians, it's like, then we're like, well, you shouldn't have lipped off to dad. Like that's kind of the right. What happens, right? And so then that becomes this, things get flattened in that. One is this idea that somehow the left is as bad as the right, kind of ways of thinking, that polarization in itself is just bad, that, well, we call them fascists and they call us communists, and it's, we're both not telling the truth. And so now we're in the situation where from the main stage of both conventions, you do have the Democrats alluding to the fact that Trump is a fascist without really saying he's a fascist and we need to stop him because he's Hitler. They didn't really say that. But then on the conservative, the Republicans literally said, that we have to worry about Marxists and the socialist takeover. And the funny thing is, the first one is fairly accurate. I don't think Trump is a full fascist. I think he's a neo-fascist, but that's a whole semantic thing. But the idea that Biden and Harris represent anything remotely similar or akin to socialism is ridiculous. But that's
hilarious.
That's what polarization has done, is that, and the problem is that actually creates an opportunity to legitimize leftist thinking and move the Overton window to the left. But we're so afraid of further polarization that we just will do anything to bring it back to the middle and go back to the way it was, where white middle-class people can go back to sleep.
Yep. And then the other axis of complexity that we don't like is the question of rioting, some sort of destruction of property, as sort of this spontaneous outpouring of rage, versus the question and issue of strategy and tactics of protest.
Yeah.
And so again, all of this gets lumped into, and this is really what we're seeing big time, from the GOP. All of this gets lumped into, bad anarchists are going to burn your city down. And then even on the left, there's, and I'm seeing this, right? Because, and particularly white folks who consider themselves progressive, don't like to be suddenly labeled as bad, right? Because they're so used to being good, nice people.
The good, nice liberals.
And so then they're suddenly like, oh yes, no, we don't want to support those bad anarchists. Everything that we did, all of our protests, nothing. There was no destruction of property. This was all them. They're immediately willing to sort of, put that off onto it's this very, very interesting dynamic, and a lot of it just comes out of this lack of time that people have spent really thinking about things like strategy and tactics, the lack of time that people have spent involved in protest and movement work. And so it all just, they just buy the blob that's being presented to them on, the evening news. And it's very unfortunate. I got some comments coming up.
So CK wrote, rioters and looters would lose federal unemployment benefits and be forced to pay for extra policing needed at protests under a new bill being introduced by a military veteran congressman. Quote, Antifa thugs are descending on suffering communities, disrupting peaceful protests and leaving violence, looting, and vandalism in their wake, Indiana Rep. Jim Banks said while introducing his, quote, Support Peaceful Protest Act, unquote, on Friday. Ain't that a load of diarrhea?
Yeah, and and again, I mean, this is a great example of exactly what I was just talking about, right? How any sort of disruptive activity just gets lumped into, here are the Antifa thugs, which, uh, yeah. So
It's I'm don't know whether to laugh or to rage, because again, some of the individuals that I could name, I could list a name of folks who are, again, quoting like, oh yeah, we need to support this uprising. It's the language that they heard. Because at first they assumed it was black people doing all that, right? And then it came out like, oh, there's some white people in the mix. And then the narrative became that all the bad stuff that happened was white people infiltrating. Okay, right. All of it. And so, which I'm more than willing to recognize that white people come and screw things up all the time. But I was literally there, and it was not all white people.
Right.
Now, no. Most of the arrests for burning the 3rd precinct have been white people. And so I've seen some of these same folks say, see, people of color weren't doing this. They were peacefully protesting and behaving themselves as servile people who have no agency of their own until they maybe got incited by some white person. And it's these white people doing all that stuff. And like, again, I understand the part of the narrative that, look, this is complex and this isn't like black leadership burning down buildings, for sure. But the idea that it's like black people behaving themselves and white agitators, and then maybe black people like get caught up in the moment because white people are leading the charge. There's so much taking away of agency and flattening of the narrative here. And so now you have these people getting arrested for burning the third precinct, who a couple months ago people were celebrating it, and now it's like the legal defense groups.
Yeah,
legal defense groups are quiet. Like it's just quiet. Yeah. Like, oh, this is too toxic to touch, so we're going to just throw these people under the bus because the police and presidential reframing worked.
Yeah, it's working very well.
It worked. And so even though we say he's a bad dude and he's a fascist, a lot of nice white liberal people really bought into the Antifa reorienting of the narrative. And that's, again, that's to me when polarization happens and your instinct is just to go to the middle to play it safe. You need to stop and ask, who is actually being the most destructive towards people's life at that moment? It's the middle that are willing to use violence to bring things back to the status quo.
Yeah, and that's, as you were talking, that was the big elephant in the room to me about all of this, which is that I think so much of this conversation, I mean, when we talk about, violence of the rioters, I mean, I started watching this Lovecraft County, this HBO show, and this first episode, which takes place in 1928, and you see the basic level of violence against Black people in every town in America. It is so sickening. I mean, it's so revolting. It's like, I get to the point. I mean, a lot of my Black friends talk about how they can't watch this stuff anymore. And I understand that. I mean, I just watch this, so there's this group of white guys, good white men in this town that, like, just for fun, go driving after these Black people to kill them, which they can get away with and they can just do. And it's like, that's what they do for fun. And I feel like all of this narrative is to continually have white folks avoid the unbelievable moral depravity that we are a part of and have been a part of, and the pain of that, and the absolute realization of the incessant violence that our society has been made up of. And that's what we don't want to look at. And so, we get all wrapped up and all this other stuff. And again, for the people whose business burned down, I mean, that's bad. I'm sorry about that. I had my barn at my farm burned down. Fires are horrible. It's a terrible thing to have happen. that is nothing compared to the global systemic violence that our society has continued to wrought on people. And we as white folks do not want to engage that in any kind of serious or substantive way.
So finally, like, comments were slow and kind of pouring in this morning.
I know. Now they're pouring in.
Okay,
so let's get
Kathleen,
at it.
I think the general apathy of voters propels the Democrats to present Trump as a fascist emergency. I think there's a lot of truth to that. There's a feeling that we have to overhype to get people to care enough to vote. I totally agree that that's totally a part of this. I think some of it is earned by Trump, but this idea of pressuring voters, I think, is a bad tactic. But we'll see what happens. Thanks for that comment, Kathleen. CK writes, when you can demonize a group, you can create precedent to do whatever you want. Forced migration, close POC businesses. If you look down Lake Street, it's turning into a ghost town. I haven't seen any ghosts living down there, but just kidding. It's a little pun. Okay, so this will be good to talk a little bit about Ed's comments, because I think there's a lot in this. Are you concerned with lack of narrative in Portland? This is very different than what you had with the narrative that Bernie Sanders and AOC and Ilhan Omar introduced. I'm not sure that Antifa is helping advance an actual left agenda. The civil rights movement had discipline and narrative. The Occupy movement did too. I think that's an unfair comparison, because, okay, if you're a politician, you get to determine your own narrative. The Occupy movement started largely around organizing, and people complain that they lack discipline because things got dicey there too. Civil rights movement, they could say they had discipline, but it was a lot of different things, a lot of different tactics happening, and a lot of it was there was rioting that happened, and there was discipline and non-discipline. It was kind of messy. That happened in the Vietnam era. You had stuff like the Weather Underground, the Black Panthers. There's different groups, and right now what we're seeing is a rupture, not a pre-planned, organized thing. But in the midst of it, people are organizing, and there is some discipline. So I mean that like, and then also like I don't. I'll let Dan take it because I could keep going.
Yeah. No, I think that. We have not had a time like this in our society for a while. And so I think this is part of what, Mark, you're getting at, is that, in the 60s and the 70s, when we had years of this sort of disruption, there was an incredible diversity of activity going on the protest front. We have just not had that. And so I think we're just not used to the fact that, not every place is going to look the same. It's not going to be organized under one big narrative or led by one party or group of people. It's going to be very multifaceted and very chaotic, Portland. I think what's going on in Portland is kind of weird. And it's not clear to me what the point is. But again, I'm not surprised about that. I mean, and I'm not surprised that what's going on there is different than what's going on here, is different than what's going on in Aurora, is different than Seattle and all of that.
All these different
because having lived through this before and been part of this before, I'm like, this is what happens. You can't control the narrative. That idea that you can sort of control a narrative is a very 21st century marketing concept, and you can't.
Well, I mean, and we also have this sort of like reverse engineered propaganda. So like I had someone comment the other day, like, who's the Martin Luther King of our time? It seems like movements do better when they have a clear centralized leader. I'm like, Martin Luther King Jr. was not a clear centralized leader.
No.
At all.
No.
He was the one, and this is a whole thing. Like, was he a leader, an important figure, and who maybe consolidated some movement energy towards specific goals? Yeah, but it took a while. And then most of his centralized leadership came after he was murdered.
Right.
And so then we kind of say, look, through the steady and confident hand of MLK and his disciplined nonviolent soldiers, the civil rights won the day. That's not what happened.
No, that's not all.
But that's what we say happened.
So funny. I know.
Or the Occupy movement being like, like a failure because it wasn't centralized. I don't think you'd have Bernie Sanders without the Occupy movement. So these things build. Yeah. And the thing now, when it's easy for us to say, like, this isn't what I do. It's like, well, it's not like the people that are burning down buildings or like had a gathering of 100 people said, today we're going to burn down these 3 buildings for these specific goals. It's more of a rupture than that. Yeah. And the way you build discipline in movements is in the between times, showing up, so that when things like this happen, you have a group of organized people who can respond collectively. And it may seem like we didn't have that, but we did. So that's why there's actually a lot of being built on top of this, from this. And it's too early to say whether it's a success or failure. I actually think the fear of burning down buildings is a motivator for normally neoliberal leaders to go further left than they would normally otherwise do. I think that's like FDR moving as far left as he did because he was afraid of Marxist union organizers bringing chaos to the streets. That was also, so it's really messy, and we can only really have a clear narrative after the fact. And sermon, sorry, I get carried away sometimes.
Go for it.
Carson writes, speaking of black nonviolence, I find it deeply ironic when conservatives and Republicans quote MLK in order to squash the riots when MLK himself was a democratic socialist. He ain't a conservative or a Republic like them. Amen. Yeah. Let's see. Mark hasn't commented for a couple weeks. First century Christianity was a threat to Rome and the other dominant powers by virtue of presenting a different narrative. They were labeled as bad people for not upholding the dominant narrative, and they held to their integrity. At least many of them did. Christianity is still here and continue to push their narrative. A life of spirit is not a safe life. A life of prophetic voice is not a safe life. No, it's not.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that one of the most threatening thing that early first century Christian communities did is they occupied property inappropriately. I mean, one of the things that got them in the most trouble was that Roman senators' wives would open up their house to these agape feasts. And you would have all these lower class people and slaves coming and all partying together. And so again, that threat of the status quo, particularly in relation to the control of property, is a very enduring theme. Mm-hmm. No.
Gus writes the other day, with the GOP's rants about socialism and the secret police supply chain breakdown and mixed with our historically large prison system, saw a tweet about how we've arrived at Stalinism, but without public housing and healthcare.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's the thing. I actually don't think that the rhetoric about fascism is overblown, and I've been writing about that on my Facebook page. I think that we need to be extremely concerned about that. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, and many people have noted that this is one of the most bizarre paradoxes of modern America, is that we're constantly going on and on about freedom, but in many ways, America is the least free of modern industrialized society, and we get the least bang for our buck in terms of our tax dollars. Mm-hmm. And that, yeah, there's a real upside downness to our perception about who we are, particularly relative to the rest of the world in some of these political categories.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We could go. We should maybe talk about meritocracy sometime, because I think that ties in with this idea that if you lack freedom, it's because you didn't work enough to make yourself free. Right. to riff off of the Auschwitz sign. Series writes, I can't watch much of the videos on black people being killed by police. It's too devastating. Yeah, I don't watch them.
Yeah, I can't watch it at all.
I don't want to underscore that. I feel like at this point, if you need to see someone being violated by the police in order to start caring, I don't think at this point you are gonna start. You should be able to care with just knowing that someone was murdered. CK writes, I want to believe that for the future of my 2 children who are half Hispanic, that this is the last push of the old white guard and the construct of whiteness. Hopefully in 10 years, my kids will live in a better place. I I hope
Yeah,
that's
well,
true.
I mean, that's the struggle that we're up against, and and this is why, and this is a strategy and tactics thing. When Trump gets up and says that the Democrats are trying to quote destroy America, I think we need to acknowledge that there's actually something to that, where there is a sense of destroying a certain version of America, right? The white supremacist version of America. Yeah, I do hope that gets destroyed. And to be replaced with a justice-oriented, multicolored version of America.
Laura thanks you for differentiating between Aurora and Denver.
Okay.
Great. Writes, if you guys want someone to come on to talk Portland protests, I'd be happy to point you to some folks involved. Actually, that'd be really helpful. Yeah.
That'd be fun.
If you could message me or put me in contact, I think that'd be good, because I think I kind of was arguing a little bit with Ed, but I think there's one of the important things about it, what he said, is that there's not a clear narrative coming out, and I think that's by design by powerful folks. But I think knowing what's going on there, and if there is a narrative on the ground, would be very helpful. Heather writes, a presidential declaration of martial law is now conceivable and achievable if the flat narrative law disorder holds. I think that's my fear. I mean, I think that's what Trump is deliberately pushing towards.
Yeah. I mean, look, the fact that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I mean, I think I think people need to, frankly, wake the fuck up. The fact that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has to come before Congress and actually say the military is not going to be involved in the election means that there's a lot of discussion about the military being involved in the election. And I think we need to take that very, very seriously. All right, let's keep rolling.
Seriously, it's what a lot of the neoliberal middle doesn't get, is that people's needs are not being met intentionally. Not to mention that idea that we don't have better process of getting their needs met in a wealthy nation will drive people mad, honestly. People will get fed up with being deprived. Yeah.
I mean, that's, and that's what drives a lot of social disruption and revolution, is that there's only so much that people can take. And and needs are not getting met intentionally. And, for example, this whole thing about people being faced with eviction, 30 million people being faced with eviction, what I have not heard a single person mention is that in order to vote, you need an address. And so if they can get enough folks evicted right around election time, that's another means of voter suppression. And I'm willing to bet money that folks in Trump's circle have thought of that.
Just to jump down to Julia's comment before talking, Ed has several. Julia writes, so yes, meritocracy and the myth of American exceptionalism have been in the Kool-Aid for too long. That's right. Ed writes, I think some of the left Antifa represent, I feel like we need to stop using the word Antifa, because I don't even know what people mean, but so either you're talking about a specific group or basically the far left, generally white, who shows up willing to throw down with cops, if you mean that broadly. But either way, I think some of the left Antifa represents the modern void of meaning and spirituality. It seems to not go deeper than fuck the fascists. People need a positive narrative and vision. I'm not blaming Antifa so much as a modern lack of authentic spiritual connection. There's a lot in there that I think is worthy of its own episode.
Yeah, maybe we could do its own episode on that.
The issue of nihilism. Why isn't there more spirituality among the far left? If there, or is there, and what does it look like? The distrust of nonviolence.
But then Carson has a reply to this. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't see that. I don't know what leftists you're reading or listening to, but the leftists and I know are deeply religious and tie the prophetic message of Jesus with their activism. See William Barber, Tracy Blackman, AOC for modern examples, and MLK, Dorothy Day, Fannie Lou Hamer for historical examples. Well, and this gets into that. Oh, go ahead.
Well, so again, it's very multifaceted and complex. And I think that the more we can hold that, the better.
Well, and part of this, Carson's comment, what is a leftist, I think I'm hearing Ed use the word leftist to refer to basically the militant or revolutionary left. Carson's examples include some of those folks, but a lot of people who would be considered left of center in a lot of ways, because I don't know if all these folks are like anti-capitalist and want to replace it with something entirely different. So that's part of the complexity too, is in our society, we do not have a lot of parties, political parties. We don't have a lot of tent posts, because we don't create coalition governments and alliances between different groups. We just have kind of a big clump here and a big clump there. And then whoever gets the most heat can pull it in their direction. And that's why polarization looks particularly the way it does in the United States. So it's really messy and complex. Julie writes, I've been saying it about no legal voting address with a looming tsunami.
There you go. Yeah. Well, I think it's, again, another great means of voter suppression. But
I do believe the rise of fascism in America around the planet is truly real.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, we've zoomed through. We're late again, and okay. So Gus has a slight addition to the.
For whatever it's worth, responding to Dan's comment, unhoused folks can actually vote in every state in the presidential elections. Many can't vote in local elections, so it's complicated. City Lab did a piece on it. To your point, it does make it so much harder, and a lot don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting, Gus. Yeah. I just know the various places that I've had to register, you need an address. So that's interesting about that.
If you don't have that,
yeah. Yeah. So, all right. Well, it's been great. Everybody's comments are great. Thanks for engaging, and we really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun. And we'll be back for another upbeat, optimistic topic tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you for all the comments. It was great, and a lot of ideas spun out today for maybe future episodes. So see you all tomorrow.
Good ones. Yeah. Bye.